Shalom lekulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to another episode of our weekly English Zoom events, where I have a guest with me here in the virtual Zoom, the virtual Zoom room, and we discuss something that's going on in the contemporary Israel, or something historical, or something that they've written. And today is a little bit different from usual. Those of you who are regulars will know that typically my guest is someone from academia in sort of either history or political science, or maybe someone working in journalism or politics. Today we're going sort of more cultural. I know there's been some requests from regulars for us to look more at aspects of Israeli culture, and I was very keen to do that, but I wanted to do it specifically in a way that touched on the topics that we, or at least some of the topics that we deal with, including Zionism and Israeli history and Jewish history. And so it was with great pleasure that I encountered our guest today, Hamutal Bar-Yosef, and her wonderful book, The Wealthy. Wait, let me try and get that so you can see it. Let's see if I get it close to me. Maybe you can see it. There you go. The Wealthy. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the Amazon page. But essentially, as we're going to discover in our conversation, it's a book which looks at both a fascinating period of diaspora Jewish history and also the early years of the Yishuv, the period of the British Mandate in Palestine leading up to the establishment of the State of Israel. As I said, I'm going to be talking to Hamutal Bar-Yosef. Before I introduce her, let me just say, for those of you who are new to this, what's going to happen is I'm going to speak to our guest for about 30-40 minutes, and then I'm going to ask you to please write questions into the chat at the bottom of your screen that I can put to her, so we can also get your questions as well as mine. Okay, Hamutal Bar-Yosef is an Israeli-born writer, poet, translator, and scholar. She's published 16 collections of poetry, which have been translated into numerous languages, as has her collection of stories, The Wall. She's also translated numerous works from English, Russian, French, and Yiddish into Hebrew. She's the recipient of numerous literary prizes. She's Professor Emeritus of Hebrew Literature at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and has also been a visiting professor in Paris, Moscow, and at Columbia University in New York. Hamutal Bar-Yosef, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Great to see you. So firstly, let me say I finished the book quite recently. It was a sort of project of mine to make sure I got it finished before we met for this event, and it was a real pleasure to read. It's a great story told in a very compelling way. I think we'll get to the sort of style of the writing a little later. But the first thing that becomes immediately clear is the incredible amount of detail, of historical detail that is in there, both from the early years, 18th century, Germany, Prussia, and then England, and then the mandate, the British mandate in Palestine. And although it's a novel, although it's a work of fiction, what it sort of made me think of were some history books that I'd read about Jewish history. I thought of Amos Elon's book about German Jewry. I thought of the recent work by the British Jewish historian Simon Sharma, who's done books about Jewish history. And you're a poet, you're a writer of fiction, you're not a historian. What prompted you to embark on this kind of project, which must have required so much research?
Thank you, Paul. I would like, if you let me, to begin by thanking you and the Begin Institute for your hospitality, for the opportunity to present this book. I would like to thank Carmel Publishing House for the Hebrew version of the book and Geffen Publishing House for publishing the translation. Thanks to the translator, Esther Cameron, I think I see her here, to the Goldberg Prize for the Hebrew book, and to all those who wrote reviews on the book, either in Hebrew or in English. Now, to your question, look, when I was at school, I didn't like history at all. I couldn't remember all these details, dates, and names of people who did not have any human dimension. I couldn't get in contact with them. And I also didn't want to learn more and more about wars, conquest, and conquerors. I had no interest in wars because I knew them. I was 8 years old in 1948. And this is, by the way, the ending date of my book. My whole childhood was under the cloud of the Holocaust on the one hand, and double fear of, yes, the British, we call them Kalaniot, the army soldiers of the British army that wore these red hats, beret hats, and also of our Arabic neighbors. My school was 2 kilometers far from my home, so before walking there, we used to gather in a group together with 2 teachers, and one of them was my father, and he used to put his revolver in my school bag. It was illegal. He sometimes didn't return home from school because the Kalaniot were searching for illegal weapons that were hidden everywhere. My only brother was killed in the 1948 war at the age of less than 18 years old. And of course, it made the atmosphere at home very difficult. So I did not want to learn about wars. But I did read everything and historical novels. I read a lot of historical novels, and most of what I know and remember about history to this very day is derived from these novels. And now, only lately, because of certain personal changes in my life, I became interested in history. And very soon I understood that history is not necessarily just a series of facts and anecdotes about the past. History, in fact, like literature, is always told with some aim: to prove something, to understand something, to justify something, to be proud or to be ashamed of something. History is a common way of, as we all know, building an identity, of strengthening the feeling that you belong to something valuable. Every nation and group used to tell its own history, generally in a way that makes the member of the group proud, of belonging to this group. This habit, so to say, has been changed lately in part of the Western world, where scholars of history and journalists try to blame their own society. But I think this tendency, this nowadays tendency is against nature, against the basic human need to be proud of the group he belongs to, even if it is not perfect. So after years of research in literature, and you mentioned that I am a Professor Emeritus of Hebrew literature, and I have written quite a few scholarly books which required work in archives, I found myself doing research for this historical novel, in which I tried to tell the story of a Jewish family, not my family, which is a very interesting story. It's a good story. And it also represents a certain aspect of modern Jewish history.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the crucial thing, that it tells this, although you said it's not your family, and obviously, every family has their own story, but in a certain way, it's it's sort of representative of a Jewish experience in Europe. Let's get into the story a little bit, and I don't want to spoil the plot for people that will want to read the book, but as I said, the book is called The Wealthy, and the subtitle is Chronicle of a Jewish Family, 1763 to 1948. 1948 obviously is a year that we all know. We know what happens in 1948. 1763 is the year that the patriarch of this family is born, Meir Heimstadt, as a poor Jewish peddler, or he becomes a Jewish peddler in Poland and then has to move to Prussia. And he lives a very poor, traditional, religious life. He doesn't have any secular education. He doesn't really know anything about the world outside of his village. Without spoiling the plot, we see that each generation of his family becomes increasingly part of modernity and increasingly moves away bit by bit from Judaism. So like his son is still traditional. His grandson becomes sort of secular, but marries a Jewish woman. His great-grandson marries a non-Jewish woman in England. And then the end point is 1948. The end point is the establishment of the State of Israel. And again, without getting into the plot too much, we see how those assimilated Jews who've moved away move slowly back towards not Judaism in terms of religious observance, but certainly Jewish identity, and specifically Zionist identity. So I want to ask you, was your main aim to ultimately reach the point of Zionism? Is the end of the story also the main point of the story? Or was it also important for you to describe the journey of Jews in Europe throughout these changes in Jewish life?
Look, I wrote a book to be read like any other novel, with pleasure. I wrote the whole book, as a series of short scenes, like a film script. Yeah. From beginning to end, the reader gets a series of actions and dialogues, sometimes with remarks about the character's feelings, but not characterization, and not any comments about the historical situation. The narrator is not there, so to say.
Right.
The book is divided into 3 parts, as you mentioned, Germany, England, and the land of Israel. And for whoever has not yet read the story, I would like to say that the dynamics or the tension or the energy of the book is gradually accelerated from part to part. I believe the facts in the book speak for themselves. It is not very difficult for the reader, I think, to understand the message of the book, especially if he or she is patient enough to read it to the very end. It's a long book. The writer is reluctant to speak about meanings, etc., but I will do it. First of all, there are no angels and no demons in this book, neither as individuals nor as representatives of their group or race. All of them have flaws, sometimes funny ones. The main genetic trait of the men in the family is impatience. Impatience is my personal fault, and in this respect, the book is autobiographical, not in other respects. And I'm trying to defend impatience in this book. Another family trait is the drive to take all useless things, even trash, and to make something useful and profitable of it. This can be understood, if you wish, symbolically. Some people hope that Zionism will do this to the Jewish people. Having said that, I should say now that this book is also asking the reader to listen to the Israeli voice in a time, I feel, that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have become, again, what we call in nowadays discourse an unconscious bias, sometimes quite a conscious one. I often hear, especially from my Palestinian friends, the word in Hebrew kibush, conquest, as a blame, as a word for root of all evil, the explanation for all bad things. And I wonder if this evil can be cured without the readiness to listen to the way we Jewish Israelis tell our story, the story of our history and the story of Israel as a state. I will go very far and say that I myself read Mein Kampf, Hitler's Mein Kampf, and I know many of my colleagues that were ready to read this book, which can be demonized. I mean, Hitler is often demonized, but I really think that you just can't solve any problem without opening your ear to voices that are for you voices of your opponent or even of your enemy. Today, it is popular to speak about racial and misanthropic biases and other biases, and to fight against discrimination and deprivation of rights, even if there is no legal deprivation. Many times, the problem is not only legal, but the problem is the image of the other. So I think the first step is to change of the image. And the change of the image cannot be done without diminishing ignorance. So I have the impression that not only outside Israel, but even here in Israel, the knowledge about Jewish history and about early Zionism is quite partial, very partial. People see the state of Israel as something obvious. Zionist culture, generally speaking, I mean, there is, speaking about the image, I would say that Zionist culture rejected the image of the suffering Jew. It preferred to call olim, upgoing, or chalutzim, pioneers, to Jews who in fact came here as refugees. Well, I want to remind the world that for 2,000 years, Jews have been refugees. And most of the Jews who live in Israel are either refugees themselves or children or grandchildren of refugees. The Western world loves the suffering sacrifice, but Israelis do not like this image even when they are suffering. So I would dare to suggest that just suffering is not a great achievement. I mean, either in private life or in history. The achievement, in my view, is what you do with your suffering, how you deal with it. And this is, I think, the achievement of Zionism, creating a place where people, especially young people, feel themselves to be just normal people, not Jews, not even Israelis, just normal. The aim of Zionism was also to get rid of anti-Semitic slurs and insults. This achievement is now, I feel, in danger. So of course, there is a message in the book, even more than one.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible to read the book without getting this kind of this sense of the writer, of your sort of, I guess, admiration for the generation that founded the state and what they did, in as well as this sort of understanding of, as you say, of the reality of Jewish life beforehand. And I will in a bit later, I have a question specifically about anti-Semitism in the book, but
I would like to remark here that I don't know admiration, because still okay. I want to remind that there are no angels.
No.
I mean, Jews and Zionists in this book are not at all angels.
Right. So one of the interesting things actually is that in the accounts of the Mandate period, you show the very, how can I put it? The ethically compromised ways in which the Jews have have to act in order to, for example, persuade Palestinians, Arabs, to part with their land, for example. Before the war, no one is forced off their land; the land is bought. But in order to persuade the landlords to part with their land, it's often sort of done in very manipulative ways, or it's fascinating. It's fascinating, and I think, and the book is more compelling for the fact that you don't, as I said, that you don't paint them in this as you don't paint them as angels. It's not a propaganda book, and I think that makes it all the more compelling. I want to turn again to the aspect of the kind of Jewish journey of this family. So one of the interesting aspects is that the children, we get to this point, as I said, where the great grandson of the founding father of this family, the great grandson is now Richard Heimstadt, living in England, married to a non-Jewish woman, very successful in business and also in politics in Britain. And his children find themselves in different ways drawn towards the Jewish people, even though they were baptized. Their mother's not Jewish. Their father is Jewish, but at this point doesn't really identify so much as a Jew.
Paul, he's not circumcised.
He's not even circumcised. Right. So his father, who was married to a Jew, had moved from Germany to England, and had enough of the kind of old ways of life, and was very influenced by his sort of atheist uncle who he was staying with as well. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. And the daughter, there's a scene in Paris where Richard's daughter Claire, who, as I said, is baptized, mother's a practicing Christian essentially, and the daughter confronts an anti-Semite that she overhears. She overhears these women talking in Paris about the people they would never marry. Like, I would never marry this person, I would never marry that person. One of them says, I'd never marry a Jew. And something inside her makes her confront this woman and says, and declares herself to be Jewish. And then there's a whole kind of journey that goes on from there with her and also her brother. But what's your intention in introducing this kind of, I guess, like plot twist, if you like, of the baptized daughter of the assimilated Englishman, Jewish Englishman, who somehow something sparks in her when she encounters? Is it because she encounters anti-Semitism? Is it something else?
Well, anti-Semitism is, I would say, central theme in this book.
Yeah.
And I knew, like every person that was educated in Israel, knew about anti-Semitism, especially in the Holocaust, which is, everybody knows about the Holocaust. But while making this research, I had a few surprises, and I will mention them. You mentioned I'm not an historian, but in order to write the book, I visited a few archives. I used Google and etc.
Yeah.
And I was first of all surprised by what I learned about Germany during the 19th century, and also about England during the First World War. I used to think that Germany during the 19th century was a relatively good place for Jews. After all, Germany made possible Moses Mendelssohn, Heinrich Heine, Ludwig Berne, Bertolt Auerbach, although they moved to Christianity. But after all, it was Germany that the idea of Hebrew as a living language, a language of speech and literature appeared first. It was in Germany that modern literature in Hebrew was first published. What I found, and this is because I didn't know well history before, an ongoing debate about equal civil rights for Jews after they were given by Napoleon in some places and for short time and taken back, but a debate that lasted about, I think, over 50 years. And much of what was written and said about Jews in this debate was no less than demonization. At the same time, Jews were very eager to be recruited to the army, although at that time, I mean, before First World War and before Bismarck, they could not become officers. And also, Jews were extremely proud of Jewish soldiers who fought in wars and killed for the homeland. Generally speaking, this unrequited love, this is the way to say it, unrequited love. Unrequited love for Jews, of Jews for Germany, which is characteristic of the entire Jewish Enlightenment in various European countries, to various European cultures, and perhaps alive to this very day. This phenomenon always seemed to me very interesting. I mean, this unrequited love of Jews to European cultures. And it was, you know, it was painful to, I mean, unrequited love is always painful. So learning more and more about it touched me in a way. As for England, I used to think of England as a very good place for Jews, at least since the Israeli, and especially during the reign of Edward VI and George V, when Jews became parliament members and even ministers. I was very surprised to find a frightening British, I would say, xenophobia during the First World War, not only toward Jews, including biting anti-Semitism in books, political movement, and public expression, and also in sort of mini pogroms. It surprised me very much. I was also surprised to find anti-Semitic expressions of British mandate officials and policemen, I mean, in their private letters, who felt much closer to Oriental people than to Jews, which I could understand. I mean, these officials had their practice, their experience in Oriental countries. They were closer to this culture than to this new Jewish Zionism with this non-polite behavior, which was cultivated at that time. By the way, I had one more surprise. I would like to share it, which has not to do with anti-Semitism, but with the way lands were bought by Jews from Arabs during the Ottoman and the British Mandate periods. You mentioned something of it. So I want to tell that the most interesting archive I set in, I found it in the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus, and it is an archive of oral testimonies of Jewish people who took part in buying lands from Arabs before 1948. This was a fascinating archive. I was sitting there about 2 months, sweating. It was summer, there was no air conditioning. And the result in the book is a few anecdotes, what we call in Hebrew tzimukim, raisins, which I took from this archive. But I think these anecdotes are very, very instructive. Before any conquest was committed, huge areas were sold by Arabic effendis to various Jewish organizations and to private people. And the way it was done is very, very interesting. When we were in school, we were taught about the Keren HaKayemet LiYisrael. Every Friday, we put a coin into blue-white box, and we were told that Keren HaKayemet go'elet adamot. Keren HaKayemet redeems, how would you say, saves, redeems the lands of it. We never knew anything about other organizations and private people who bought lands in this country.
Right.
And I wanted to tell their story because I think they were very important. Much money were poured into this land, not only blood, but also much money.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. No, that comes across, and it's one of the sources of sort of anger of the local Arabs, that they're complaining often in the book that the Jews always have so much money that they're able, or at least not obviously every Jew, but behind them they have these wealthy Jews who are able to finance these land holdings. Just to comment on the anti-Semitism thing, that in reading the book, one of the things that's so interesting is that you take us through different periods of history and also different countries. And in all of them, there is anti-Semitism, but at each sort of period of time and place, it's a little bit different, right? So it's this kind of very, in your face anti-Semitism in Poland and sort of pre-revolutionary, pre-Napoleonic, the pre-Napoleonic times. And then there's the opening up of places to Jews when the mayor's son and grandson Gotthold goes to university in Germany, but there's still this animosity against Jews, and this, the Jews can never quite be part of they can't be part of the aristocracy. There's a scene where he has a duel with another student, and it's a kind of it's almost an insult to the other student that he's having to duel a Jew. It's this, this terrible thing. The Jews are sort of looked down on, even while the doors are opening up to them. And then, as you say, in England, where Gotthold moves to England, partly because England offers more emancipation to Jews at that time. There's already members of parliament and this kind of thing. But even there, after his son Richard marries a non-Jewish woman and enters parliament himself, and even becomes the government minister, he still faces all these snide little comments wherever he goes. And there's all these innuendos, this anti-Semitic innuendo. It's really, really fascinating.
I would like to add, Paul, if you let me, Paul.
Sure, please.
So I tried, I don't know if I succeeded, to understand or to present the point of view of people who are anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. I think I gave voice not only to Jews, because all these people are human beings.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what makes the historical novel different, I think, from a work of pure history. That the novelist is a good novelist is almost obligated to give their characters, as you say, to give their characters a certain to give them three dimensions, to make them real people with all the foibles and flaws. So just to go back to this question of assimilation a little. So as I said, Richard Heimstadt's assimilated, his children are assimilated, and then they move slowly towards their Jewish identity. But why was it important to you to have this plot line of a Jewish, even though it's kind of historically, of course it's historically accurate, but it seemed to me that it was absolutely critical to the development of the characters and the development of the family, that it's this assimilation, this gradual assimilation of a Jewish family over 4 generations, before Zionism sort of brings some of them back. What was it about that assimilation idea that was important to you?
Yeah. Look, assimilation is an option. I mean, some people are sure that it's an option. I know people who just wonder whether it could not have been better for Jews to assimilate and save the world from all the troubles they are making. Nowadays, especially when in young Western culture, especially among intellectuals, nationalism is very unpopular.
Right.
I'm sure there are also many Jews and Israelis, especially among those who live abroad, who would like to have cosmopolitan identity and get rid of their disturbing Jewishness. I can understand that. but I am sure that it is just not possible. At least until now, it was not possible. If you decide not to be a Jew, you have to become something else. Christian, Muslim, English, French, American, and often it will be you alone who considers himself non-Jews. Others will go on looking at you as a Jew.
Right.
Richard Helmstadt was not circumcised. His father left him the choice to be or not to be a Jew. He chose to baptize in order to marry an English girl of Huguenot origin. But as a parliament member during the First World War, he was attacked and insulted by crude anti-Semitism. Right. And his visit to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel, together with Weizmann, is the turning point of the plot. So, of course, I want to say something.
Yeah. There's a great, if I can quote, I'm going to quote the book. There's a reference to a political scandal involving a Jewish member of the government. And the man in question says, a Jew more than any other man has to keep his hands absolutely clean in appearance as well as fact. And Richard replies, when an Englishman is accused, it is he himself and not all England that is on trial. Like, Jews have to be whiter than white because otherwise they reflect all Jews. Okay, so Richard is a fictional character, Richard Helmstadt, in this, as I said, this historical novel. But once we get to Richard, this story of a family, of a fictional family, enters the world of real historical events, right? Because we're getting to British support for Zionism, and then the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate. So you place Richard in conversations with real people, with Chaim Weizmann, with Herbert Samuel, with David Lloyd George. So I want to know, are these conversations based on real conversations that you read about, that you know about, or are they imagined conversations based on what you know about real events?
Well, basically they are based on historical sources, but I allowed myself to reformulate them for the sake of interest and artistic play. Sometimes I put such dialogues just because they surprised me and I wanted people to know about them. Like we just talked before this meeting about the Montague reaction to the Balfour Declaration.
Right, Edwin Montague, the Jewish member of parliament, Jewish minister who was very anti-Zionist, right?
And the fact that he was responsible for the sentence in the Balfour Declaration that keeps or defends the rights of non-Jews in Eretz Israel. So I didn't know about it. People don't know about it. I think it's important to know about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. It's really,
well,
as I said,
the teacher in me comes out.
No, I think this is the thing. The book, as I said, it's a novel, but you learn so much history from it. Okay, I'm going to quote a passage to you, and then ask you a question about it. So this is Richard after he finds, at long last, his Jewish identity in the land of Israel. This is the guy who, as you say, he wasn't circumcised. He marries an English Protestant woman. His kids are baptized. So he says about being in Israel, he says, when I come here, I feel that a great weight is lifted from my shoulders, the weight of play acting, pretending that I am more English than the English, that I'm not a German, God forbid, that I'm not a Jew, God forbid, or at least I don't behave like a Jew. And I need to prove it at every moment, again and again, to take care at every moment, not only to act, but to feel completely English, to forget that I'm a Jew, to be different from my father, from my grandfather. Here, I am freed from that strain. Now, the reason why that spoke to me and why I copied it out in order to put it to you is that it's a perfect articulation of a Zionism, or at least of a certain way of thinking about the Zionist impulse. What inspired this passage for you?
Yeah, you are speaking in fact about the ideal of normalization that was part of early Zionism.
Right.
But yeah, But I'm afraid this passage was inspired by what I heard maybe 20 years ago from a good friend of mine who lives in New York, in Manhattan, by the Hudson River, beautiful house. The family is well-to-do. Her son, and New York is a good place for Jews, as we all know. Her son was about to finish a non-Jewish high school. He had excellent marks at school. And she told me that she, being worried for him, as all mothers do and are, said to him, you have to be careful. You cannot afford to do what other boys do. You have to remember that you are a Jew. I must say that I was greatly surprised that to these very days, a Jewish teenager, at least from the point of view of his mother, should be careful because he's a Jew. And I must say that I think there are some advantages in this Jewish situation. It explains Jewish achievements in Western cultures, and I don't know how much of it remained here. So sometimes I'm sorry that here in Israel, high school pupils do not have to be careful in that sense. But seriously, still the fact remains that it is not possible to get rid of your Jewishness. And if feeling at home as a Jew is important for you, perhaps it is not, you better live in Israel, which, like any other countries, is not perfect.
Right. Okay, so I have one more question that I want to ask at this point. There's plenty of questions I could ask. I could talk a long time about this book, but I have one more question I want to ask. But I do want to invite people to start writing the letters into the questions into the chat. So please do that while I put this last question of mine to Hamutal Bar-Yosef. So I read the book in English. Sadly, my even after many years here, my Hebrew would at least mean that I would take a very long time to read the original in Hebrew. But you obviously wrote it in your mother tongue in Hebrew. So are there important differences? Are there any important differences between the original that you wrote, of course, and the English translation that I read?
I don't know if they are important, but there are changes in the English translation, which was made, as I mentioned, by Esther Cameron with my collaboration. Some historical facts were corrected to be more exact with the help of my partner, Robin Dwight. Some details which a non-Jewish reader would not understand were either omitted or presented in a clearer way. And most important, the book was shortened. Not very much, but considerably. Anyhow, when translated into English, it always looks longer, right, as you know. So it was good to shorten, which I now, as a poet, to conclude with, to finish, I always like to shorten.
Right. Yeah, for those of you on the Zoom who are not familiar with this comparing of English and Hebrew, an English version of a Hebrew book is invariably sort of quite a lot longer, because the Hebrew is a much pithier language. You get much more said in a fewer words. Okay. Firstly, I'm just putting in the chat a link to the Amazon page for those of you that wish to. I'll do it again before the end. But please do check out the book on Amazon and purchase it. And I'm going to go to a question from Shmuel Yerushalmi, who says, what can you say about the participation of Jews today in BDS and other anti-Israel movements? Can we see that Jewish, that sort of anti-Zionist Jews, in a way, or anti-Israel Jews, are reviving anti-Semitism and are unlearning the lessons of the history that you've told in this book?
Well, I think that in modern times, at least, Jews were always good in criticizing themselves. And there is a positive aspect to this tendency, but sometimes I feel, at least vis-a-vis attacks and lies, that it becomes exaggerated.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. Judith Kornblatt asked, can you say a few words about the title of the novel? Okay. So the title, as I said, is The Wealthy. I assume that's a direct translation of the Hebrew. The Hebrew is Ha-Shirim. Right. So what can you tell us about the title of the novel? Why did you choose that?
Why did I choose it? It's in a way, it's ironic because the family was not wealthy from the very beginning. And the wealth was collected, so to say, or created by very, very hard work. So the image of Jews is the wealthy Jew. This is the image. This is part of the anti-Semitic image, I'm afraid. Right. So, yes, I mean, this is the way the Arabs, Palestinians saw the Jews that were coming here. But I think when you read the book, you see that the wealth did not save them from suffering, from working hard, from losing their money, from all sorts of, I mean, it's in a way an ironic title.
It's a great point, actually, because one of the things that you note is that the as you said, the money is made through incredible sacrifice of time and health and happiness. I mean, at least I when I think about it, I would not want to be married to some of the characters because they're so like Gotthold, who sort of makes the wealth in the family. I mean, he's such a workaholic. He's like, I think it's sort of terrible for his family in all kinds of ways, and also Richard to a certain extent as well. It's very interesting. Okay. Okay, there's a question. Oh, so Bernice just says, how can we find the book? So as I said, I put the Amazon link. It's probably also on Book Depository, which you can also get sometimes if you're in Israel. But I don't know where you are, Bernice. If you're in Israel, then Book Depository is maybe better because it's usually free of postage and packaging fees. Harry Gluck wants to know, is there a plan to do a follow-up covering the period of 1948 onwards? Is there going to be a sequel?
The answer is no.
Okay, can I ask why?
Writing historical novel is not my natural tendency. Right. I must tell you that if you will let me, I'll go on. This is a confession. I myself am a terrible workaholic. And people often ask me, how can you manage to do so many things, etc.? So I feel like I have to apologize. I felt before writing this book that I need to take a project that will take me a long time. So this project took me, I mean, writing the book took me about 5 years. It's not like poems.
Right.
And okay, I experienced it. It was okay and enough.
Fair enough. Yeah, as I said right at the beginning, the amount of research that you must have had to do in order to get these details. I mean, really, I want to stress to the audience that the detail of like the first several pages, which is, you know, from a time, you know, like 250 years ago or whatever, and the specifics of, for example, to our ears, the kind of bizarre traditions that these very poor, traditional, to our eyes, kind of primitive Jews in Poland were living. It's really quite extraordinary. Like some of the superstitions and the things. It's really fascinating. And again, you see it again when we zoom forward to the 20th century and mandate Palestine, and you also go into a lot of detail also about the traditions of the local Arab population, which is also really interesting. and some of the stories, the sort of anecdotes, which are kind of tangential to the main story, but which give us information about the sort of lives that the Arabs are living. Also, that the British, as you said, when you said that you wanted to make sure that the non-Jewish voices are also heard, the non-Jewish attitudes are also heard. So you kind of hear like what the British think about the whole situation, both their anti-Semitism and their, as you said, their kind of philo-Arab mentality, their sort of affiliations in a way with the Arabs, but also just their kind of sense that like it's such a mess, right? That the Balfour Declaration created this mess. Like, why the hell are we here having to deal with this kind of thing? That's also.
I want to add one sentence that in the third part it's mostly about tension between Zionists and Arabs, but right. There is at least one chapter, so to say, about the locust.
Yeah.
That shows the possibility. Can you hear me? That shows possibility of togetherness and collaboration.
Right. There's a shared problem. Right. There's this shared problem of this almost biblical plague of locusts, which sweeps the land. And I think it's even during Pesach. I think it even happens like during the Pesach period. But yeah, that is very notable that there are voices in the Jewish camp that want to work with the Arabs because it affects them as well. It's really that's really fascinating. And also the nuances. I said about the nuances that, for example, what I wasn't aware of, or maybe it's something I read but I forgot from years ago, is that you have Arabs who are working with the Jews, not because they're Zionists, but because basically they're getting something out of it. Like they're either getting paid or they're sort of not satisfied. They're in a bad situation in their family, in this very sort of tribal society. They're in a bad situation. So it kind of, they're getting something personal out of working with the Jews. It's really interesting. It's very interesting. Okay. Do we have more questions? I'm going to wait. I'm going to ask people to ask some more questions. In the meantime, while we do that, I'm going to just ask about, I want to ask about, I mean, you've talked about in your answers about some of the contemporary echoes, right? Some of the things that are happening today, which in some way are connected to the themes of the book. You mentioned your friend in New York and how that spoke to you about the assimilation question. There's a bit in the book where I think it mentions that the Times of London, the British newspaper, is publishing letters from Jews of German origin. This is during the First World War, declaring their loyalty to England. Right, and there's this fear that the Jews are gonna be accused, and they are accused of dual loyalty, of not being proper Englishmen. And that, I think, to me at least, that has so many contemporary echoes that still today you hear it now. Of course, that we have the state of Israel, you hear Jews in the diaspora being accused of being more loyal to Israel than they are to their host countries. Is that something your that concept in the contemporary sense, in the year 2022, is that something you're familiar with?
I must say, I did not know that this phenomenon exists to these very days. Now I'm learning for you.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Israel creates a different dynamic, I think, but there's this kind of horror. You present this kind of horror in the media, in the British media, that when Richard Heimstadt becomes a government minister, because he becomes a minister at the time, I think, if I remember rightly, during the First World War, that the idea that this man from Germany, or actually, well, he's not from Germany, but his father's from Germany, becomes a minister. Okay, we have a question here from Jonathan Forstott, who says, you said that this is not autobiographical, right? This is not about your family, but do you have any stories from your family history about these kinds of ideological struggles?
My family came to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel, in 1936 from what at that time was Poland and now Ukraine. And when I could visit Ukraine and Russia again, my mother was still alive, and I asked her whether she would like to go there. And she said, no, by no means. When I was a teenager and I was walking in the street, I was harassed, and because I was Jew, they threw matches with fire under my skirt, and I don't miss the place. This is at the same time that she adored Russian. She finished a Russian high school. She was, I think, one of the two only Jewish girls. It was selection, and she loved very much Russian culture and literature, but she didn't like local. I mean, the place is Rovna, the town they came from. She did not like neither a Soviet Russia as a political entity nor Russian people. So I think this is very characteristic of enlightened Jews, educated Jews, that they adored the culture, the European culture, but they suffered, and they did not like the local culture.
Right, as you said, it was this unrequited love. It was this this unrequited love with the place they came from. Okay, I think we've reached the end of our discussion. So I want to thank Hamutal Bar-Yosef very much for her time, not only in joining us this evening, but also the 5 years that she spent writing this book. I've put again the link to the Amazon, as well as my email for those of you who want to join my mailing list and get details of the English events that we do at the center here, both here at the center itself and also on Zoom. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you'll agree it was a fascinating conversation with Hamutal Bar-Yosef. Really got us inside the mind of the novelist, of someone who poured their heart and soul, and as I said, however much time of research, I can't even imagine, into producing this wonderful book. So please buy the book, read it and enjoy it, learn from it as I did. And Hamutal, thank you again very much. Thank you everyone for joining us. And I will hopefully see you next week. Bye everyone.